have with me three guests who actually are not in the studio. They are further afield, and I'm going to introduce them to you. First of all, we have with us Kamran Hussain, who is the chair of Yorkshire Humberside Liberal Democrats. We also have Afzal Khan, who is Shadow Deputy Leader of the House for the Labour Party. We have Kirsten Seymour, South Asia political analyst and a colleague of ours, host for The Pulse. We did invite James Daly, a Conservative MP, but unfortunately he wasn't able to join us. Before I formally include our guests into the discussion, many of you will have seen the horrific media coverage, the pictures, the images, the videos of what is happening there in Israel between the Israeli forces and Palestinians. And in particular, the escalation of military force that is being used within that particular area. This is something that is not new to us, but what we have seen in the last few days, in the last few weeks, is an escalation of military action. Now, when we talk on these programs, we have our own understanding. And it is important to say on the outset that the opinions of my guests are their opinions. They are not the opinions of our particular network. However, what we want to be able to do is to have an inclusive and open discussion, hence the program Unscripted. So first of all, I want to bring in, if I may, one of our guests, and I want to actually start with Afzal Khan, who is the Shadow Deputy Leader for the Labour Party. Now, Assalamu alaikum, Afzal, and welcome to the programme. I can't actually hear Afzal, so hopefully I'm going to be able to hear him in a few seconds.
I hope so.
Yes, I can hear you now. Afzal, I want to start with you because being in the opposition and holding an important position like yours, and if I may say so, coming from a particular background, and I refer to your faith being of a Muslim faith, there are certain expectations from people around us, and I think that stands for anybody who's of faith, whether you be of Muslim faith, Jewish faith or Christian faith, that in a conflict such as this, where places of worship are being attacked, if I may use that word, where the actual escalation of military forces in particular is targeting particular people of faith, and in this particular instance the information that we have is of the Muslim community there. How does it feel to be sitting in the Houses of Parliament trying to push some of those questions, very tough questions, to our present government?
Well, there's two parts to your question. The first one, I suppose, is as a person of faith, seeing a place of worship attacked like that, and how do I feel? So for me, it was almost like throwing a petrol on a fire, exactly what the Israeli government, particularly I would say Netanyahu, who's behind all this. And if you look at it in the context that, of course, this is a dispute which has been going on for almost 7 decades. There's been lots of suffering throughout this period. But then to pick an area which is East Jerusalem is actually a Palestinian, it's part of the Palestinian area. It's an occupied area. And then within that, you find that there's a mosque, which is Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the holiest places of worship for the Muslims. And then picking a month, which is a Ramadan month, which is again one of the holiest months of the 12 months we have. And then to picking the night, which was Laylatul Qadr, which itself is the night of power. So where all devoted Muslims throughout the world use that time as like a gold dust to pray. So you had thousands and thousands of worshippers there, and pushing the police in with the tear gas and rubber bullets and other things being used. It's absolutely disgraceful. No place of worship, irrespective of the faith, should ever be violated like this. And I think every decent person in the world should actually condemn this. This is not right. It doesn't matter what the faith is. It's the whole context, I think, where it is. And then the second part is being here as a parliamentarian with Britain, seeing this escalation of violence there. Again, I suppose for me, the problem ultimately is that as a British government, we have a moral responsibility. And I say that as a moral responsibility because I think historically, Britain has had a hand in Palestine, and just like in Kashmir. So both these areas are the two longest unresolved disputes on the books of the United Nations. And both of them are sort of attached to us as Britain. So there is that whole responsibility in a historical context. But then if you bring it forward, then you realize that Britain is also a permanent member of the UN. And therefore they have a prime responsibility to uphold the values and the rules and regulations from which the UN is based on. Again, seeing this occupied territory is an issue. And then on top of that, you then go further and you look at Britain here. You know, we are an amazing country with a large number of Jewish people, large number of Muslim people here as well, and people of no faith. All those are also connected up as well. So in that sense, at every layer, there is a responsibility on the government. And I find it disappointing that actually you don't have anyone from the Conservative Party here. If one of them couldn't make it, I don't understand why another one isn't here. Do they not value sharing this platform and giving their view with what is happening in the world? So that I think is frustrating in that context for myself being a member of parliament, then being here, yet not finding anybody from the government. Because whatever I say, whatever our other friend from the Liberal Democrats say, the hard truth is this: we are opposition. The best we can do is simply talk. The best we can do is trying to hold the government to account. But it's actually the government who can do things. And what is needed now is action.
I mean, I was actually listening to some of the questions that were raised, and in particular, one of the questions that you raised recently, and it was actually making reference to COVID vaccinations. And you talked about, and you asked the question in terms of, the question about COVID vaccinations and how the Palestinians were not given equal treatment. You made reference to protection, equality, health equality, the basic essentials that we talk about when it comes to human rights. But the question I want to ask you in particular, you made reference to, and in fact Boris Johnson in his response, our Prime Minister did also make reference to a two-state solution for peace. Can you, before I move on to our other guests, and in particular I'm going to ask Kirsten to come in on this, what do you mean when we talk about a two-state solution to peace?
Well, I think in this whole issue, the first point is, if you look at it in historical context, what you know is that this whole land was Palestine. And then because of the changes in Balfour Declaration, the Britain then decided that there will be a part given to the Jewish community, which is fine. The UN sort of established this bit. They were given a good fair share of that land. And then here we are. What I don't understand, first of all, is how come, a land which was Palestine, you get then this part given to Israel, and which Israel is recognized as a very powerful state now. And then the other side, in Palestine, is not even recognized.
We've just lost our...
yeah, I hope you got me back.
Yes, we've got you there, so please carry on.
Yeah, so how is this?
Right, so whilst we get the connection back, I mean, actually, it's quite a good point to bring you in, I think, Kirsten. I mean, Kirsten, you are a political analyst for South Asia. I want to ask that question. If you can maybe answer that question for us, why is it then that the rules seem to have changed? Some people are actually calling the Palestinian tenants, and there seems to be some parallel in the narrative that is being used across with the Kashmiris in terms of what is happening within Indian occupied Kashmir, and the people of Palestine no longer own that land, no longer are residents, but in fact seem to have some sort of tenancy agreement and not paid their rent. And I'm actually making reference to a letter, Kirsten, that was actually sent by our Member of Parliament, Christian Wakefield, Member of Parliament for Bury South. And if I may read this before I ask for your response. It says, with regards to extremely complex dispute in Sheikh Jarrah, it is my understanding that the extensive litigation over many years established that the Palestinian residents do not hold proof of ownership, but enjoy protected tenant status. As protected tenants, a mutual arrangement was agreed in 1982, and they could continue living there as long as they paid rent and maintained the properties. But in February 2021, the Jerusalem District Court upheld an earlier court decision that after non-payment of rent and illegal construction on the property, the Palestinian residents must vacate their premises. What's your thought on that, Kirsten?
Well, I don't know when that letter was. I mean, I think it's interesting you bring it up because it does point to something that I don't think the international community is doing just yet, which is looking at the core issue. A lot of the experts are saying, we're getting these skirmishes all the time. They've been going on, like Afzal has said, for 7 decades. But in the last 10 years, they've sort of taken on a new shape in a sense, with actually having 3 participants in the area, which is Hamas actually having a division among the Palestinians now. And I think that creates a whole new complexity that a lot of the outside world doesn't understand, that now we're looking at a conflict inside of a conflict that has stemmed from what Christy Harker had written that you've just read. And I think looking at how Parliament has dealt with that at the moment, that is interesting to me. But at the moment, what's really connecting Kashmir to the crisis in Israel and Palestine, the ongoing, never-ending crisis, is the inability and the lack of the United Nations to agree to a resolution.
And what can that resolution look like, Kirsten? Because if we actually look at the narrative and we look at the dialogue, what can it look like? Everybody talks about peace deals, and I haven't seen any paper which doesn't mention those words to talk about having peace deals. Now, what deal could be struck?
Well, there have been resolutions and deals, but all they've ever amounted to, like what we saw with in 2014, the Egyptians sort of fostered a cessation of fire and buying time. And then another all-out war comes along that happened in 2014, 2015, 2019. And really, you're making a valid point that no resolution really has ever, a concrete resolution, never really been made. What you get is delaying more problems. And it doesn't go away. It won't go away this time. The Jordanians are involved right now. The Qataris are there, of course, all the usual actors and players are there. Biden is not as participatory as I thought he would be. He was golfing yesterday, so I'm surprised by that. But I think the international reaction to this has been very different in that there's a little bit of, like, for example, President Biden doesn't have the same influence that Trump had over Netanyahu, obviously. But he's also supporting that Netanyahu has a right to protect his state and act in this way. But it's the disproportion compared to what the Palestinians are able to do. They've been shelling rockets, but they're going to be running out soon. And then what's going to happen? You've got obviously the gates are closed now. Gaza Strip's closed down. So how this may escalate, and I am going to get back to answering exactly the point that you're making, is now Egypt has offered a deal, and this is what they call a deal, and this is their idea of a deal, is 1 year ceasefire and a calm, temporary resolution. And you can see how many times that's happened. It's happened with Kashmir as well, and it's just delaying the pain, delaying the obvious. And in the meantime, Palestinians aren't able, like Kashmiris, aren't able to be self-realized, to develop their communities, to have basic human right freedom of being safe and secure with your family. And seeking prosperity in a human democratic world like the United Nations is representing all these various countries that we are supposed to protect and make sure these things don't happen. So unless we come up with some core actual resolution, like even a one-state resolution, the first two-state resolution came in 1992 from Prime Minister Yedlik, who actually said that Palestinians deserve a fair voice and to be treated equally. And he came up with the two-state solution in one of the first conceptual ways that might have worked. But of course, the hard right-wing Jewish community or the Zionists wouldn't acquiesce or concede an inch. So it doesn't go anywhere unless you have compromise on one level. Without that compromise, it just doesn't. There is no resolution. It's like a Greek tragedy.
I mean, you actually do sort of bring on many of those points in the fact that it is actually quite a very complex situation, and even from within. I'm going to bring Cameron into this discussion now. I was just reading some information and some of your points that you've made across different forums, and you point out the fact that around 138 countries recognise Palestine, but the US, France, Germany, and others do not. The recognition of Palestine as a state would be a huge signal to the international community that the unequal treatment of Palestinians, exemplified by the potential evictions that we've seen in Sheikh Jarrah, must end. Now, Cameron, I want to bring you in on this because you, being a Liberal Democrat, you're obviously seeing what is happening, the government's narrative and the rhetoric, and in the way that they're responding to some tough questions that have been asked in the House. You're also seeing what I may call pressure from the opposition. But you, how do you see it when you see this sort of a two-party sort of dialogue going on within the United Kingdom, and there are certain parallels with Kashmir, as you've also pointed out previously in previous conversations. Do you believe that the starting point, if I may ask that question, needs to be an actual international recognition of Palestine?
Well, certainly, let me start by condemning what's happened. Sadly, human rights abuse have been taking place, and the world has turned a blind eye. The reaction of the current government in the UK has been way too relaxed. The lack of representation from Conservative Party tonight indicates the level of respect perhaps they are giving to this whole issue. The reality is young children have lost their lives. And as a father of young children, I could not see my children hurt, never mind going to the cemetery to bury them. Now, my colleague in the House of the Parliament, Leila Moran, who is of Palestinian descent, has raised a very urgent question in the House of the Parliament to say, look, enough is enough. We can't simply just talk about this any longer. The government has to work with its colleagues around the world to send Israel a very, very strong message that by recognizing Palestine, you're taking that one step to achieving long-term peace. Because it's not only about Palestine and Israel, it's about the whole region and what damage this is doing to it. Now, one of the early points you asked was, is it of a particular religion? And that's why we're so passionately speaking out about this issue. I don't think that's the issue. I think every religion and people of non-faiths, when they see young people being killed, when they see innocent lives lost, when human rights abuses are taking place, anybody with half of heart will have the guts to stand up and say, look, this is wrong, and it should end, and it should end now. With every minute that's going past, all we are simply doing is allowing more lives to be lost, and that should not be taking place.
Yeah, thank you. Afzal, I'm going to come back to you because right at the beginning we talked about a two-state solution. At the moment, in terms of the information that is coming out from across the field, I'm talking about the international community, this regime that we talk about, the regime of oppression, and more people are talking about a regime. this regime that we talk about, do you think it's truly understood by the international community? Do you think that they truly have understood what is happening there? And I ask this question, Afzal, with all due respect to everybody that's involved in any kind of international diplomacy, and you spent many years within the European Parliament talking about peace and working with communities, is that what kind of proposal is it when Turkey is talking to Pakistan and other countries, and they are proposing a joint military force deployed in Palestine to protect the Palestinian people? How does that make you feel, and is that the way forward?
Well, for me, I suppose one thing is clear, that there is a cycle of violence. And the guest you had earlier on was talking about this point as well. What you get is, what they're interested from the Israeli government's perspective is, how do we make sure nobody challenges our occupation? How do we make sure that we can carry on systematically absorb this occupied land into their interest? And this is why, despite so many 7 decades, they still haven't even declared what is their boundaries. Where is the state of Israel? And you see on the ground this idea of two-state solution, where basically both states can safely, securely, in a viable way can operate. It's actually vanishing. This whole area of Palestine, they're cutting it into bits. We've already seen how you talked about Gaza, that whole strip has been separated from the West Bank as well. And then basically East Jerusalem, which was part of the West Bank, being annexed. And then I thought it was quite interesting earlier on when your commenter said maybe Trump had influence on Netanyahu. I thought it was the other way around. I thought Netanyahu had influence on Trump. That basically where the ground reality is. And I think looking ahead on the question you've asked about Pakistan and Turkey, look, the first point on the legal side is this is an occupied land and there is a international law violation taking place, and the international community has every right to support the Palestinians. So that I think is there. Now, is this the way forward? No, I don't think this is the way forward, because what it would mean is we'll end up with more violence. What the way forward ultimately is that the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jewish community, they have a long track record of being together in that part of the world. You know, they're part of Abrahamic faiths, and they're almost cousins in faith. And in that sense, what needs to happen is they need to live and let live. And live and let live is where we need to focus. That's where the future is. And through that, we can have prosperity. And I think it's the Israeli government who are systematically playing with this game, deliberately preventing any deal happening so that they can keep eating into this Palestinian land. And that, I think, ultimately is the issue. And that's why we can't have this cycle of sort of calm and then violence, calm and violence. But really, the international community has to step up their game. And if that means tightening the screw on Israel, that needs to be done now so that ultimately we can achieve which the international community want to see. And I think most good, decent people in Israel and in Palestine would want to see a lasting peace between these two groups.
And do you think, I asked that question again in terms of the joint military force, whether that be Turkey or any other country, I mean, I know that many other countries have made references, Iran in particular has made its viewpoint very clear, and many other countries will continue to do that, not just from the Muslim Ummah, but beyond those countries. So do you believe that having military force, a joint collaboration or a coalition is a possible way forward?
Well, you can't rule that out. I don't think it's going to happen personally. But the bottom line in all this is, you know, if there is an occupied land, if there is a country which is violating international law, do you have a right to support those who are being oppressed? And I think international law allows that. And I think the UN actually allows this as well. The right of self-determination is pretty fundamental. And what you have is in occupied land is the Palestinians resisting Israel. They have every right to do that. And you just imagine it, in any country, if somebody comes and invades that, do you have a right to self-defense? Of course you have a right. Do you have a right to push them out? Of course you have. So that fundamental right, if somebody attacks your home here in Britain, I have a right to protect my home. Same, that right actually applies to the nations. And that Palestine, they have a right to actually resist. And we've seen this, how long this has been going on. And the problem I have is that the Israeli government systematically doesn't want to talk about that, keep talking about their right to self-defense. How can an oppressor, how can someone who's occupying somebody else's land talk about self-defense? That doesn't make sense to me.
I'm going to come to Kirsten and see if you can try and make sense of some of the other questions that I've got. One of the things Kirsten, that's come out from this is, if you look at across media, and Afzal Qarali makes reference to the fact that if there is a community or a country or a group of people that are being oppressed, then as an international community who believe in human rights, then we have a right to support them, because that is a question, isn't it? Is what that it seems to be that you're either on one side or the other. And the question I want to put to you is, do you think that's a fair analysis, that you are either on one side or the other, however and whatever you may describe them as being?
The word fair, I don't know. I don't think it is fair. However, I mean, I think what you get is you get some very strange, it's a terrible thing to say, strange sort of bedfellows. Like, for example, in the United States, and this is reaching to the point that in the United States you will have, or Canada for that matter, you will have right-wing anti-Semites who are pro the Israeli state. So you get this strange hypocrisy where people just, either you don't know, are they just completely ignorant and uneducated and don't understand the situation, or does this reach to being, I don't know, double racism in there somewhere, being anti-Arab, but that somehow trumps being being anti-Jewish? So you can be an anti-Semite, right-wing Republican, and be more pro-Israel than Jewish Americans. So it is really difficult to answer that question, because you find so many queer, bizarre sort of ways of relating to the issue. Then obviously, you had today some anti-Semitic language being used by some Palestinian supporters going through London. So it's all finger pointing and everyone's so bad. And the whole thing is just, it's so terrible, as Afzal says, and Cameron, we all forget that these are actually people's lives. These are, I think Cameron said, you'd be taking your child to a funeral if you were there. So I do think that sometimes we get very far removed and very desensitized, and we have fluctuating loyalties that align in ways that you'd have to look at each case to understand why that's happening. I will say that a tricky intellectual thing that is maybe being done by Netanyahu and Israel, and of course he's not an extreme right-winger, but when you start to employ a strategy of, it's sort of it's known as a colonial divide strategy, where you actually now are seeing the Palestinians becoming very divided. So you don't see Mahmoud anywhere right now. You don't see the Palestinian Authority. What you see is Hamas. So Hamas takes this, and they're the ones who are defending the Palestinians in the Palestinian case. They're the heroes. And then the leader of the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, is nowhere to be found. He's in the West Bank, and there are some Palestinians who are siding with him. the recent elections that he delayed, they believe it's because he didn't think he was going to win those. So I don't think a lot of people understand that internal politics is almost as hot and as conflictual as and as difficult and intransigent as what we're seeing with the rockets. And I can't help but notice a trend that every time there's a conflict with Iran and Israel, there's suddenly a big flame up of Palestine. But it is worrying internationally, because it always seems like the Israeli issue in the Muslim community is one of the most universally felt, other than Kashmir, but probably more for a long time with the Arab Spring and all the various, things that we've seen with the Iran-Iraq War and all the destabilization that's gone on in the Middle East, almost to its total disintegration, that Israel is the one fear, hatred, and the way they treat the Palestinians is something that is unifiably felt throughout the Muslim community, unlike anything I've seen. So it is worrying to see the riots in Montreal, and it's going to be interesting over the next 2 weeks to see if we end up with like a George Floyd reaction, where everyone just shows they're fed up with what's going on with the Palestinians.
I'm actually going to now ask all my three guests to come in as you feel appropriate. Palestinian Lives Matter is something that are now taking its own wave, and we've seen across social media certain references to hate narrative against certain communities, Kirsten did make reference to one or two of the incidents that happened in London. What's quite interesting, please come in on this, out of hundreds and thousands of protesters that have come out across the United Kingdom that we're seeing here, and then across the globe, across many cities with people from all walks of life, that we've seen a tiny minority of people that have used certain language which has been condemned by everyone, that it seems to be on top news across certain social media streams. Again, when we talk about having an actual equality in terms of what's happening out there, do you think that is something that is done on purpose, or do you think it's just a flare? What are your views on that, without actually going into the actual, in terms of the mechanics of what happened, because obviously we're still learning more and more as we are, because Kirsten, you have brought this up. What are your thoughts there?
Let me start this off, and then I just want to go back to what Christine was saying as well. So the point you're asking, actually, to me, it doesn't matter whether it's a single incident or a 2-3 small minority doing it. We should all actually condemn this. Any form of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, we are actually united on this. And I think it's right that there should be condemnation. I've done this. I'm sure others have done this as well across the party. So that, I think, is an absolute spot-on position, because any of those people who are behaving in this manner, they're certainly not helping the Palestinian cause whatsoever. And it's at the heart of it, it's against actually what the Palestinian cause is all about. What the Palestinian cause wants to make sure is that there isn't that sort of racism going on. It's about fairness, it's about equality. Now, on the issue of some of the things which have been discussed earlier on of divisions within the Palestinian ranks, I would argue the other way around. I would say that what has happened now actually has unified the Palestinian cause. Even in the West Bank, actually, you will see in the next day or two, there's going to be huge demonstrations against what is going on. I've seen sort of similar messages coming through across the board from the Palestinian, whether they were in West Bank, whether it was Gaza, whether it was inside the Israel, or whether it was in the Arab world. You see this consistency messaging coming through. On the reverse side, you could also argue that actually there is enough division within the political spectrum of the Israeli system. You've seen in the March election taking place, and then you saw that Netanyahu actually couldn't make a government despite making a number of attempts. And when it was asked by the Labour Party to see if they could form a government, you suddenly had what happened in what I said in Gaza, not in Gaza, sorry, in Al-Aqsa, and the whole issue, how it was escalated. And I think I wouldn't be surprised that this was calculated to make sure that some of the right-wing parties wouldn't even think about supporting the Labour Party in Israel. And therefore, Netanyahu torpedoed the process internally within themselves.
These critical dimensions that you make reference to, Afzal, do you think that they've actually come over a period of time? Do you think it's because of the escalation? Or is it because of the international sort of focus on it? How has this come about? Because Kirsten makes reference to the complexities and the multifaceted elements of that particular region. It's not as simple as Jewish, Muslims, separate states, independence, right for self-determination. It's not as simple as that, is it?
My position is that it's not that there aren't these things don't exist. Of course they exist, but these are sideshows. Don't bring the sideshows into the main show. The main show, I think, is the Palestinians, the occupation, and how Palestinians' land is being stolen, how their houses have been pushed out, not in the Nakba in the early period, but this Nakba idea is still going on. And exactly this is what sort of as a catalyst which has happened now as well, because in the East Jerusalem, the Sheikh Jarrah area, the houses they want to push out, you talked about it, the tenants, etc. Come on, it's a Palestinian area. And Israeli courts trying to decide this? No, it's the international court which decides this. And it's an occupied land. They have no right. Of course, they will give sort of judgment which suits them, because that's the whole plan of whichever Israeli government it is, whether it's been a Labour Israeli government or the right-wing governments. They have one thing consistent, and that is consistently stealing the land of Palestinians.
I mean, Cameron, I want to bring you in this because right at the beginning you talk about human lives, the elements of human lives. And how was you as a father, if you were there, you would, God forbid, possibly taking your child to the grave. The reality is that these are human lives that are being lost on both sides. Wherever there's a conflict, it's on both sides. There's the oppressor and the oppressed, and then there are civilians. And there are those people are innocent bystanders within those particular regions. I'm not talking about one army officer against another army officer. I'm talking about civilians in this. Am I going to ask you the question? Do you think that if we accept that there are huge complexities in this, external, internal forces which are pulling and pushing the dynamics there, then the international communities, the international world and regional stakeholders have a role to play, perhaps? Would you agree with me?
Well, I think in terms of the dimensions, it's very simple. You've got the oppressed and the oppressors. You've got people whose lives have been turned upside down. You've got people who are unable to go and do the things that we do on a daily basis. You've got people who don't know if they're going to have a roof over their heads because it's going to be hit by an airstrike. You've got people who wake up tomorrow morning not knowing if their parents are still going to be alive or their children are going to be alive. So I think the issue really is, in a simple way, very, very simple. If both parties want to achieve long-lasting peace, then on the part of Israel, they've got to accept that Palestine has a state, is a state, and they will not encroach and take more land from them. And on the part of Hamas, they will also say, well, look, we will not cause any harm to our neighbors. And that means that, whatever they are doing, they need to control themselves as well. You talked a little earlier on about the slogan, Palestinian Lives Matters. Well, around the world, we accept that every life matters, and this thing about Black Lives Matter really brought to the forefront the issue about the treatment of people of certain color. And similarly, we around the world have a duty to recognize that people's human rights should not be abused, and people should not lose their lives. So as an international community, we have to stand together and say to Israel, look, what you've done is wrong, and you must stop now, and let's bring peace, a long-lasting peace, and not just a very simple solution which will last for 6 months or 12 months, and then when the political dynamics change, we're back to square one again.
Kirsten, if I may bring you in on this, Afzal made reference earlier to perhaps, I'm sure it was Afzal, made reference to a 1-year ceasefire where they can, one possible way forward was for them to be able to then move forward. Is it as simple as that, Kirsten? Cameron said it in the most simplest way, that it's up to the Israeli government and the Palestinian state to work together to come to a resolution, to work on this, or do you think it's more complex than this, that there are other, perhaps, if I may say so, international factors, politics, trade deals, diplomacy, in terms of regional developments and stakeholders, and the whole issue of connectivity that is going on between all the surrounding neighbours and beyond?
Okay, well, that's a lot. Let's see, where can I start? Well, simply put, the one year sort of period of calm, I believe, that's been introduced by Egypt. It's, even though, you know, it's very early days, this has been, like Leon Panetta, the former CIA director, said, this is different, this looks different, this feels different. Hamas is far more aggressive than they've been in the past. You know, Netanyahu is clearly not going to be backing down, and that's obvious. He's not going to back down until Hamas is dealt with. You know, they've focused on getting all of the tunnels and all of the buildings that they've had intelligence and operated out of, or had an Al Jazeera interview out of. So it's never going to be as simple as a 1 year unless everyone puts their weapons down. But they're telling us they're not going to be doing that. So no, that's not going to happen. And in
what
the
happens
next
at the end of that year, Kirsten? Say
that 1 year,
everybody wants ceasefire. They want the opportunity for it to stop. But what happens after the 1 year?
Well, that's just been introduced, and I don't think that they'll agree to that again. And I think what we're going to be, it's going to maybe be a different circumstance than we've had before in the past, where Hamas, you know, we're already looking at the Damascus Gate not being open. So this is going to get worse. It's going to escalate before it gets better. That's very clear by what all sides are saying, despite what the UN is suggesting, that to try to talk to all sides. All sides are openly saying they will not back down. They are going to carry on fighting. And in the meantime, they're running out of supplies. Palestinians are already looking at energy shortages, food shortages, in just this short period of time. We are, you know, it's going to escalate. So in a long term,
listening to an earlier report, Kirsten, just as you said quite rightly, that they have 4 days perhaps of fuel supplies, which means that the fuel that will then be able to run the electricity, that will be able to run the whole sort of operations, and 4 days. And it was a question that was put by a journalist to one of the advisors to the PM, and the response was, well, we're going to carry on responding, and if it means that they run out, basically they run out, and there was no proper response to that.
Benny Gantz said last week, Benny Gantz, the foreign minister, said the Israeli Defense Forces are moving forward. They're not going to be moving backward. And I think Egypt has opened their border for wounded people, you know, children in particular. I think 1/3 of the wounded people are children, which is a terrible atrocity. And Jordan is bringing in doctors and medical care, but no one has talked about food. So I wonder if that might, when you asked, when do you provoke or evoke something like a Me Too movement, or like the Black Lives Matter, Palestinians Matter, that's when you tap a nerve of something that's already there, that's been there for a long time, under the surface, and finally something just like wildfire moves throughout all social groups. and everyone finds it unacceptable, regardless of, like Afzal said, regardless of race, religion. It's a human situation. It's a human
and thank you,
problem.
Kirsten. We have actually come to the end of the program, and I think
Yes.
it is a conversation, a very lengthy conversation, a very complex situation and conversation. And I want to thank all our guests, and in particular yourself, Cameron, Afzal, and Kirsten, but those people that have been on social media, that have been involved in that discussion. I think the discussion goes far and wide. So thank you. And in days and weeks to come, I'm sure that we will continue having a discussion on this. So we have come to the end of today's program. As you have heard from all the guests, no matter what their political background, no matter which school of thought they belong to, no matter what their colour, creed or faith is, one thing is that we all condemn any kind of atrocity and the oppression of any person, whoever they may be and wherever they may be. And Palestinian lives do matter, just as quite rightly Cameron said, that every life does matter. We have come to the end of the programme. This is a new programme, Unscripted, and what I hope to be able to do in days and weeks to come as your host is to bring you those issues and those topics that we can talk about totally unscripted. Thank you.